Mother-in-law burned my wedding dress just before the ceremony to stop our love. Just moments before my wedding, my future mother-in-law does the unthinkable. She burns my wedding dress. You won't believe what happens next. I thought my dream wedding was ruined, but I wasn't going to let anyone take this from me. Stay tuned to find out how I turned everything around and what happened to my relationship with my mother-in-law. Trust me, this is a story you don't want to miss. I never thought it would come to this, standing here, in the middle of what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, heart-pounding, surrounded by the wreckage of my dream wedding. My name is Anna Carter, and I'm 32 years old. I've spent years building my life, working my butt off to get to where I am today, a successful project manager at a top company in Chicago, engaged to a man I truly love. But today, it feels like everything is crumbling around me. I thought I had everything in place: a beautiful venue, a perfect dress, a loving fiancé, and a family that, despite their issues, would support me. At least, that's what I hoped. The moment I laid eyes on my mother, standing there in the bridal suite, I knew something was off. She was always the type to be overly critical, but this was different. The tension between us was thicker than it had ever been before. You see, my family is complicated. Growing up, I always felt like I had to prove I was good enough. My mother would constantly compare me to my younger brother, Jake, who could do no wrong in her eyes. He coasted through life, barely lifting a finger, while I worked tirelessly to make something of myself. I never wanted to be the one to beg for attention, but it felt like that was the role I had to play in our family dynamic. Every accomplishment I made, every job I nailed, I still wasn't enough. I was always the backup plan. And now, with my wedding day just hours away, I should have been feeling joy, but I was drowning in this overwhelming sense of unease. And then there was Ethan. Ethan Mitchell, my fiancé, the man who loved me without hesitation. Ethan was different from anyone I had ever known. He was kind, down to earth, and genuinely wanted nothing more than to spend his life with me. But my mother hated him. I couldn't understand it. He wasn't the flashy type, not the wealthy businessman she'd always dreamed of for me. Ethan wasn't from an elite family. His family didn't have the same social status that my mother craved. To her, he was just a guy from the wrong side of town, an outsider who didn't belong in our world. I didn't know why it bothered me so much, but I could feel the anger bubbling inside me every time she subtly insulted him, every time she questioned my choice in front of me, making me feel like I had made a mistake. That afternoon, while I was getting ready, I overheard my mother talking to my brother in hushed tones. I couldn't make out all the words, but what I did hear made my blood run cold. She was still scheming, still trying to convince me that Ethan wasn't good enough. "She's just marrying him for stability," I heard her say. "She's always been chasing after security. Don't let her ruin everything." I froze. It felt like someone had just sucker punched me. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her that I wasn't doing this for anyone but myself, that I wasn't marrying Ethan because he was a safety net, but because I loved him. But I didn't. I just took a deep breath and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. As the time for the ceremony approached, I retreated to my bridal suite to collect myself. I was alone, well, almost. My bridesmaids were there, getting ready, but I just needed a moment to breathe. I didn't want to think about what was coming. I wanted to focus on the man I was about to marry and the future we'd build together. That was all I cared about. But that peace didn't last long. The door to the suite opened, and in walked my mother, her high heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, a look of fury in her eyes. "Anna," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "you can't marry him." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling, the knot in my stomach tightening. Before I could process what was happening, she stepped closer, a lighter in her hand. "This wedding is a joke," she hissed. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." I stood there, stunned, unable to react as she raised the lighter and flicked it on. In that split second, I realized exactly what she was doing, what she intended to do. She was going to burn my wedding dress, the very dress I'd spent months planning for, the one that made me feel beautiful, the symbol of the new life I was about to begin. And just like that, it was gone. Flames quickly engulfed the ivory satin, the fabric shriveling and blackening before my eyes. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just watched, helpless, as my dreams turned to ash. In the chaos that followed, my bridesmaids stood frozen, their mouths agape in disbelief. No one knew what to do. No one had ever seen my mother act like this before. The sound of the flames crackling was the only noise in the room. I felt a rush of hot tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to let her win. Not today. Not like this. I took a deep breath and walked over to my phone, trying to steady my shaking hands. "You have no idea what you just did," I told her, my voice firm, though my heart was pounding. She scoffed. "What?" "I saved you from making a huge mistake," she said, dismissing my feelings as if they didn't matter. "You think this is love? This man, he's not good enough for you. You need someone with more, someone who belongs to our world. Not him." Her words stung, but they didn't have the power they once did. Not anymore. I wasn't going to let her control me. This was my life. My wedding. I wasn't backing down. I pressed a button on my phone, and suddenly the entire room fell silent. The live stream of my wedding had been running for the past 20 minutes, capturing everything from the guests arriving to the musicians setting up. But now, it was showing Margaret, standing in the middle of my bridal suite, grinning as she destroyed my wedding dress. I turned the phone toward her, her face falling when she saw what was happening. "What is that?" she demanded. "It's the live stream of our wedding," I said, my voice steady. "It's been broadcasting for a while now. And now, everyone can see you for who you really are." Her face turned pale and she lunged toward me, but I was already 2 steps ahead. I had her. Everyone was watching, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let her win. I don't know what I was expecting when I walked into the bridal suite that day, but it certainly wasn't what I walked into. The moment I saw the flames creeping up the delicate satin of my wedding dress, it felt like everything I had been working for, everything I had been dreaming of, had just been ripped away in the blink of an eye. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the flames lick at the fabric, warping and blackening it, turning my once perfect dress into nothing but a charred ruin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind screamed in disbelief, but my body frozen could only watch. And there she was, my mother, standing in front of me, the lighter still gripped tightly in her hand, her eyes wide with a manic gleam of satisfaction. "You can't marry him, Anna," she said, her voice sharp and cutting, like she was somehow in control of the situation. I felt a sudden, cold fury rise within me. The audacity! The nerve! What did you just do? I barely managed to choke out the words, my voice a shaky whisper, a mix of shock and anger. Her lips curled into a cruel smile as she tossed her designer purse over her shoulder, the subtle shift in her posture signaling that she thought she had won. "I saved you, dear," she said in that condescending tone that always made me feel like I was a child. "You don't deserve him. You think someone like you belongs with a man like Ethan?" She scoffed, her eyes glinting with something between pride and malicious glee. "You need someone with real status. Someone from the right side of town, not him." I stood there trying to process her words, but they were like daggers cutting through me, tearing at the fragile boundaries I had spent years trying to build. I'd known she didn't approve of Ethan, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. She wasn't just rejecting him. She was trying to destroy everything I had worked for. It was clear now, the extent of the control she wanted over my life, the hold she still had on me, even after all these years. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her how wrong she was. how her obsession with status and power had poisoned her mind. But I didn't. I stayed silent for a moment, fighting the overwhelming urge to fall apart. But then I heard Ethan's voice in my head, his calm, soothing words that had always helped me through the tough times. You are strong. You are worthy. His face flashed in front of me, his soft smile giving me the courage I needed. I wasn't going to let her ruin this for me. Not this time. The room was thick with the acrid smell of burning fabric, and the silence between us stretched uncomfortably. My bridesmaids, Jessica, Melanie, and Sarah, stood frozen, their lavender dresses a stark contrast to the smoke filling the room. They were too stunned to speak, their eyes wide with disbelief. I could see the shock in their faces, but I couldn't let it break me. Not now! Not with everything on the line. I'm calling the wedding off, my mother said, her voice dripping with finality. She turned her back to me, as if she had already won, already decided my fate. I'll just tell everyone you got cold feet. They'll understand. They'll know it wasn't meant to be. Her words were like nails on a chalkboard, each one digging deeper into my soul. But I wasn't going to let her have that satisfaction. I wasn't going to let her turn my wedding day into a joke. I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking, but I managed to tap the screen and pull up the live stream of the ceremony that had been running for the past 20 minutes. I had been planning on using it for the guests who couldn't make it, my grandparents in Florida, and my sister who was stationed overseas, but now it was the perfect weapon. What's this? I said, holding the phone up so she could see the live stream, showing the guests gathering outside the venue, the musicians setting up, and, most importantly, the clear shot of her standing in front of my ruined dress. This is what you just did. And now, everyone can see it. Her face changed instantly, the confidence in her expression faltering. What is that? What are you doing? She took a step forward, her eyes darting to the phone, then back to me, the rage starting to bubble up. But it was too late. The live stream had already captured it all. The moment, the destruction, the malice in her eyes. Turn that off, Anna, she spat, her voice rising with hysteria. This isn't what it looks like. I was just testing the fabric. Wedding dresses are supposed to be flame retardant, you know. She was backpedaling now, trying to spin the situation, but her words were falling flat. She knew just as I knew that no one would buy it. I could hear the murmurs from the other room, the guests who were watching, probably confused, unsure of what was going on. My phone buzzed in my hand, a flood of notifications coming in from friends and family. Some had already seen the live stream. Some had already started texting me, asking if everything was okay. One of my bridesmaids, Tina, stepped forward, trying to open a window to clear the smoke from the room. But I wasn't paying attention to the smoke. I was focused on her, on my mother, who was still trying to make excuses. Jessica moved closer, her voice calm but firm. Miss S. Carter, everyone just saw you burn the wedding dress. You need to think about your next move. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but my mother didn't seem to hear them. She was too consumed by her own need to be in control, to manipulate the situation to her advantage. I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching outside the suite, growing louder. Jason. Ethan? He was coming. My heart skipped a beat. He would be here any moment, and I had no idea what I was going to say, what I was going to do. How could I explain this? How could I make him understand that his mother was trying to tear us apart? Just then, the door burst open. Ethan stood there, his tuxedo sharp, but his face was filled with shock and fury. His eyes darted between me and my mother, and then down to the ruined dress on the floor. I could see the raw emotion in his face: hurt, confusion, anger. He wasn't used to seeing his mother like this. He wasn't used to seeing me like this. Mom, Ethan said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge to it. Tell me I didn't just watch you burn Anna's wedding dress while telling her she isn't good enough for our family. His words were a punch to the gut, and I could see my mother flinch, but she didn't back down. She opened her mouth, but Ethan cut her off. "Stop," he said, his voice rising. "Stop lying!" I heard everything. He turned to me, his expression softening. "Anna, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she would do this." I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't about me crying. This was about me standing up for what I wanted, for what I had earned. This was about not letting her win, not letting her control me any longer. "It's just a dress," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside me. "But your mother just showed me exactly what she thinks of me. Of us." Jason looked back at his mother, his face tight with disgust. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think you need to leave. You're no longer welcome at our wedding." Her face twisted in anger, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then, she just stood there, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what was happening. "You would choose her over your own mother? After everything I've done for you?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Absolutely," he said firmly. "You've crossed the line, and I won't let you do this to her. Not anymore." My mother stood there, speechless, as the room filled with the weight of what was happening. The live stream was still running, and I knew the world was watching. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. This wedding wasn't going to be stopped. Not by her. Not by anyone. So, now that you've seen the chaos unfold, here's the question: how will I react? Will I walk away from everything, or will I stand up and fight for what I want? I'm dying to know. What do you think happens next? Drop your guesses in the comments. Do you think I'll still go through with the wedding? Or will it all fall apart? Comment 1 for "it's over" or 2 for "she'll make it happen." I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I stood there, staring at my mother standing amidst the wreckage of my wedding dress, and realized how much I had underestimated her. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I'd spent years trying to please her, trying to gain her approval, always walking on eggshells to avoid her judgment. But now, standing here with everything falling apart around me, I knew that I was done. Done being her puppet. Done living in a shadow she had cast over me for so long. Ethan stood beside me, his hand firmly gripping mine, and for the first time that day, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had to think fast. The dress was destroyed. That was the reality I had to face. The beautiful ivory satin that had taken months of planning and alterations was now just a pile of blackened fabric. My vision for the day, the image of myself walking down the aisle in the gown I had dreamed of for so long, was completely shattered. But I couldn't let that be the end of it. I couldn't let my mother's petty, vindictive actions define my wedding day, not after everything I had gone through to get here. I turned to Ethan, my mind racing as I spoke. "Ethan, we can't let this ruin everything. We need to move forward, no matter what." I could see the concern on his face, the shock still lingering in his eyes, but there was something else there. To resolve. He nodded, his grip tightening around my hand. "You're right. This isn't how we imagined it, but we're not giving her the satisfaction of stopping this wedding." His voice was calm, determined, but I could tell that under the surface, he was just as shaken as I was. We didn't have much time. The ceremony was supposed to begin in less than an hour, and I needed to get my head together. The guests were all gathered, waiting for the bride to appear, unaware of the chaos unfolding backstage. I looked around the room, my mind desperately trying to focus. My bridesmaids were still frozen in shock, their faces pale, but I knew I had to be the one to take control. I could see Jessica, standing closest to me, her lavender dress a soft contrast to the smoke swirling in the air. "Jessica," I said, my voice shaking but resolute, "call the venue coordinator. Tell her the ceremony is still happening, but we need to make a change." She nodded quickly, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she moved to make the call. I turned back to Ethan, trying to hide the panic creeping up inside me. "We need a backup plan," I said, my voice almost pleading. "Do you know if there's anything else here?" "A backup dress. Something I can wear?" Ethan looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he thought, then shook his head. "There's nothing here, Anna. But we can't let her win. We'll figure something out. I knew he was right. This wasn't about the dress. This wasn't even about the wedding itself anymore. It was about showing my mother and everyone who was watching that I wasn't going to let her tear me down. This was my moment, my choice, and I was going to take it back. Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the venue coordinator, and I could see the concern in her eyes as she stepped into the room. "Miss Carter," she said gently, her tone professional but soft. "We've been getting messages from the guests. They're all asking what's happening. Should we make an announcement?" My heart was racing as I glanced at the wreckage of my dress on the floor. I could hear the voices outside, the low hum of the crowd, waiting for the bride to appear. And I knew that if I didn't do something now, the wedding would be over before it even began. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. "Tell them there's been a change of plans," I said, my voice firm, though it felt like my whole world was crashing down around me. "But the ceremony is still going forward. In 20 minutes, the coordinator blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm demeanor. "In 20 minutes?" she repeated, as if it was impossible. But I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed what I had said. "I'll let everyone know," she said finally, nodding in understanding. "I'll also get the musicians ready for the revised timeline." As she left the room, I turned back to Ethan. I could see the concern still etched in his face, but there was something else there now, pride. It was subtle, but I could see it in the way he looked at me. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was impressed by my determination. We didn't have a backup dress. There was no magical second gown hidden somewhere in the venue, but I knew that I wasn't going to let that stop me. I wasn't going to let my mother's actions, no matter how cruel or calculated, be the defining moment of this day. This was my wedding, and I was going to fight for it. I turned to my bridesmaids, my mind racing. "Melanie," I said, my voice low but urgent. "Remember that photo shoot we did for Cleveland Bride last month? Call Eliza. Ask her if she has any sample dresses left. Something simple but elegant. It has to fit, and it has to be ready in time." Melanie's eyes widened as she realized what I was asking, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll make the call," she said quickly, pulling out her phone. I turned back to the chaos in the room, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to back down. My mother thought she could ruin my wedding, thought she could tear my life apart with one selfish, vindictive act. But she was wrong. I was stronger than that. I had worked too hard, come too far, to let her have this power over me anymore. Time was running out. The ceremony was still set to begin, and I had no idea if the dress would arrive in time. But there was a calm inside me, a quiet certainty that I had to keep moving forward. I couldn't let the situation control me. I had to control it. I had to fight for the wedding I had dreamed of, for the life I had fought so hard to build. And just as I was about to lose myself in the overwhelming stress of it all, I heard the sound of the door opening again. It was the venue manager, and she had a look on her face that gave me a glimmer of hope. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice full of urgency. "We've got good news. Eliza has the sample dress. She's sending someone with it right now. It should be here in 20 minutes. Relief washed over me like a wave, but it didn't last long. The clock was ticking, and I knew I still had a lot to do. But for the first time that day, I felt like things were finally starting to fall into place. My mother's actions weren't going to ruin this wedding. Not today. Not ever. This was my moment, and I was going to take it back, no matter what it took. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as I stood there, surrounded by the chaos my mother had created. The air felt thick, almost suffocating as I tried to focus. I knew we were on a tight timeline, but with everything falling apart around me, it was hard to think clearly. I could still hear my mother's voice echoing in my head, her cruel words, her insistence that I wasn't good enough for Ethan, that this wedding was a mistake. It felt like I couldn't escape the weight of her judgment, but at that moment, I knew I had to push past it. I had to stay focused. Ethan was still beside me, his hand firmly gripping mine, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't saying anything, but his presence was enough. He was here with me. He believed in me, and that made all the difference. "We're going to get through this," I whispered to him, trying to steady my breath. "We're not giving her the satisfaction of ruining our day." He gave me a reassuring smile, but I could tell he was worried too. He had every right to be. This was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, and now it felt like it had been hijacked by my mother's cruelty. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not like this. Not today. I turned back to my bridesmaids, who were still standing in shock, their faces pale with disbelief. Jessica had just returned from calling the venue coordinator, and now she was frantically dialing someone else. I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried to find a solution, and I was grateful for her calm presence. But even with the support of my friends, there was a part of me that was scared of what might happen next, scared of how this would all unfold. Would Ethan still want to marry me? Would he ever forgive me for not seeing this coming? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts from my mind. This wasn't the time to second-guess myself. I had to stay strong. Then, as if on cue, the door to the suite opened and the venue coordinator stepped in. "Miss Carter, we've been getting some messages from the guests. They're all asking what's happening. Should we make an announcement?" The panic was evident in her voice, and for a split second, I felt the weight of the situation settle back in my chest. How was I going to explain this? How could I make everyone understand what had happened? The clock was ticking, and I needed to figure out a way to salvage the situation. "Tell them there's been a change of plans," I said, forcing the words out with as much authority as I could muster. "But the ceremony is still going forward. In 20 minutes. The coordinator looked at me, her brow furrowed with confusion, but I could see her processing my words. "In 20 minutes?" she repeated, clearly unsure how we could possibly pull this off. "I'll let everyone know," she said finally, nodding with a mix of skepticism and determination. She turned to leave, but not before adding, "I'll also get the musicians ready for the revised timeline." As soon as the door closed behind her, I felt my breath leave my body in a shaky exhale. Was I crazy for thinking we could still do this? How could we possibly go on with the ceremony when everything felt so wrong? But then I looked at Ethan, standing next to me, his face etched with determination. And in that moment, I realized he was right. We weren't going to let her ruin our day. We had made it this far, and we were going to finish what we started. We weren't backing down. "Do you think we can do this?" I asked, my voice small but desperate for reassurance. "Can we really pull it off in 20 minutes? Ethan smiled, a calm and steady smile that made me believe everything would be okay. "Of course we can," he said, his voice unwavering. "You're stronger than you think. We're going to make this happen." I tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over, and for a moment, everything felt clearer. I had a plan. I was going to make this work. I wasn't going to let my mother's cruelty destroy what I had with Ethan. "Melanie," I said, turning to my bridesmaid who had been on the phone moments before, "do you have Eliza's number?" She nodded quickly, pulling out her phone, her fingers tapping the screen with urgency. "Call her. See if there's any sample dress available. Anything. It has to fit, and it has to be here soon. The ceremony can't wait much longer." Melanie didn't hesitate. She was already dialing, already trying to make something happen. "I'll call her right now," she said, her voice focused, determined. I looked at the remains of my dress on the floor, my mind racing. I didn't care about the dress anymore, not in the way I had before. Sure, it had been the one I had dreamed of wearing when I walked down the aisle, but what mattered now was the commitment I was about to make to Ethan. The wedding wasn't about the dress. It wasn't about the venue or the flowers or the guests. It was about us, and nothing, not even my mother, was going to change that. As Melanie spoke into the phone, I tried to calm my nerves. I knew this was going to be difficult, but I was prepared to fight for this. For Ethan. For us. I could already feel the shift inside me, a quiet strength that had been there all along, waiting to be unleashed. It wasn't about perfection. It was about pushing forward, about choosing love, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Just as Melanie finished the call, the door opened again. This time, it was one of the venue staff, holding up a simple white dress. It wasn't the gown I had dreamed of, but it was beautiful in its own right. Elegant, simple, and perfect in its imperfection. "It's here," the staff member said, and I could feel the relief wash over me, though it was short-lived. I still had so much to do, and I knew the clock was ticking. I looked at Ethan again, and for the first time that day, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I had a dress. We had a plan. And most importantly, we had each other. We were going to walk down that aisle together, and nothing, not even my mother, was going to stop us. The weight of the moment hit me all over again as I watched the clock ticking down. The wedding had been turned upside down, and yet somehow we were still moving forward. My dress was gone. My mother had destroyed it in the most dramatic, heartless way possible. And in its place, I had to find something, anything to wear for my wedding. I felt a cold, sharp anxiety in my chest, but I pushed it down. There was no time for fear, no time for panic. We had 20 minutes until the ceremony was supposed to start. 20 minutes to fix everything. I could hear the muffled chatter from outside the bridal suite, the guests probably wondering where the bride was. What had happened? They had no idea. They had no clue that my entire vision for this day was being stripped away, piece by piece, by my mother's mind games. How could she do this? How could she sabotage her own daughter's wedding like this? It was like she was still trying to control me, to bend me to her will, but I wouldn't let her anymore. I refused. I glanced over at Ethan, standing beside me. He was still calm, but I could see the fire in his eyes. He wasn't happy at all, but he was with me. And for the first time that day, I realized just how lucky I was. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about the two of us and the love we shared. Nothing could change that. Not my mother. Not a ruined dress. Not anything. "You're doing great," Ethan said, his voice steady and reassuring. It was like he was holding me together with his words alone, like I was the one who needed to be calmed down. But the truth was, he was the one who needed me to be strong right now. He needed to know I was still determined, still the woman he was about to marry, no matter what had happened. "I don't know how we're going to pull this off," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "This was supposed to be perfect, Ethan. I don't even recognize what's happening anymore." Ethan smiled softly, the warmth of his touch on my hand grounding me. "We're going to make it work, Anna," he said, "because it's us, and nothing else matters." His words pierced through the fog of panic in my mind, and I felt something inside me shift. Of course, it wasn't the wedding I had imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that we were standing here, together, facing this challenge, and we were going to make it through. Just then, Melanie, one of my bridesmaids, rushed back into the room, holding a dress in her hands. It wasn't my dream gown, the one I had spent months selecting, but it was white, simple, and elegant. I couldn't believe how fast she had found it. Eliza had pulled through. She had sent a sample dress in record time. Maybe it wasn't the one I had envisioned, but in that moment, it felt like a miracle. "I got it," Melanie said breathlessly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It's not your original dress, but it's beautiful. It's ready. And it fits." I could hardly believe it. For a split second, I felt the sting of disappointment. This wasn't the dress I had dreamed of wearing when I walked down the aisle. But then I took a deep breath and reminded myself that it didn't matter. The wedding wasn't about the dress. It was about Ethan and me, about the vows we were about to make. And that was what truly mattered. I turned to Ethan, who was watching me intently, waiting for my reaction. "I guess it'll have to do," I said with a weak laugh, trying to keep the nerves from creeping back into my voice. "But it's beautiful. Thank you for sticking with me," he smiled, squeezing my hand. "You're beautiful no matter what you wear." His words made my heart swell, and for a brief moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just us, standing in this little bubble of love, and nothing else seemed to matter. No one could take this away from us, not my mother, not a ruined dress, not anything. I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. It wasn't the gown I had imagined, but it would work. It would have to. I slipped into the simple white dress, feeling its soft fabric settle against my skin. It wasn't what I dreamed of, but it fit me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked at myself in the mirror and took a deep breath. I was ready. The minutes felt like they were slipping away faster than I could keep up with. But somehow, I was holding it together. It wasn't the wedding I had envisioned, but it was still mine. And as I stepped out of the bridal suite and made my way toward the ceremony space, I could feel Ethan by my side, his presence stronger than ever. It didn't matter that the dress wasn't what I had wanted. It didn't matter that everything had gone wrong. What mattered was that I was marrying the love of my life. And no matter what happened next, nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to take that away from me. I walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress, my heart full of love for Ethan and the life we were about to start together. As I approached the altar, I could hear the murmurs of the guests, the quiet buzz of their voices as they watched me, their eyes wide with curiosity. But I wasn't worried anymore. I wasn't worried about what they thought or what my mother had done. I was focused on Ethan, on the man who had stood by me through all of this, the man who was about to become my husband. And as I reached the altar, I saw the look on Ethan's face: pride, love, and a determination that mirrored my own. We were going to make it through this. Together! Nothing else mattered. I barely had time to process everything that had happened as I stepped out of the bridal suite, ready to walk down the aisle in the borrowed dress that was only a shadow of the gown I had dreamed of wearing. My heart was racing in my chest, my nerves a tangle of emotion and adrenaline. I wasn't sure if I was terrified or exhilarated, but there was a sense of quiet determination that had settled over me. I was still going to marry Ethan. I was still going to walk down that aisle, no matter what my mother had done. The hallway was bustling with the last-minute preparations for the ceremony, people rushing around, making sure everything was just right. But it didn't matter to me anymore. The details, the perfection, the dress, it was all secondary. All I could focus on was Ethan, the man who had stood by my side through all of this, and the commitment we were about to make to each other. Everything else faded away. As I walked toward the entrance to the ceremony space, I could feel my hands trembling slightly, but I steadied myself. I couldn't afford to let the nerves take over. I couldn't let my mother's actions, her cruel sabotage, dictate how this day was going to end. This was my wedding day, and I was going to take it back. I reached the threshold of the ceremony space, and I could hear the murmur of voices from the guests, the soft rustling of fabric as they turned to see me. I knew they were waiting for the bride to make her grand entrance, but I wasn't just any bride. I wasn't the one they expected. And yet, as I stood there in the doorway, I felt a wave of strength wash over me. I had made it this far, and nothing, not even my mother, could take this moment away from me. The music swelled, and I took my first step onto the aisle, my heart in my throat. It wasn't the grand entrance I had envisioned, but it didn't matter. I wasn't the person I had been when I first imagined this day. I was someone stronger. Someone who had faced the worst of my mother's manipulation and come out the other side. And now I was about to start a new chapter of my life with Ethan. I could see him standing at the altar, his eyes locked on mine, a look of relief and love on his face. And in that moment, everything clicked into place. It wasn't about the dress or the flowers or any of the things we had spent so much time planning. It was about us. It was about the vows we were about to make, the future we were going to build together. Everything else was noise. As I walked toward him, my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I kept moving, one step after another. The guests were still watching, but I didn't care about them. I didn't care about the judgment or the whispers. I was doing this for me. For Ethan! For us. When I reached the altar, I saw the pride in Ethan's eyes. He was standing tall, his expression full of love and determination. And I realized something then. This wasn't just about overcoming the crisis of the moment. It was about facing the future together, no matter what challenges came our way. It was about building a life that was ours, without the interference of anyone else. I was choosing him, and he was choosing me. That was all that mattered. I took his hands in mine, feeling the warmth of his skin, the connection between us. The rest of the world could have disappeared in that moment, and I would have been fine, because I knew that whatever happened next, we were in this together. The vows we spoke were simple, but they held more weight than anything I had ever said before. They were promises, not just to each other, but to ourselves. We had come this far, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to tear us apart. As we exchanged rings, I couldn't help but feel a rush of emotion. The days leading up to this had been filled with uncertainty and chaos. But in that moment, I knew we had made it. We had fought for each other. We had stood up to everything that had tried to break us. And now, we were starting something beautiful. The ceremony ended, but it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like the beginning of something new. The reception that followed wasn't what I had envisioned, but it was even better. The tension had been replaced by a sense of unity and celebration. Ethan and I danced, surrounded by people who truly cared about us, and it felt like a victory. It wasn't the wedding I had dreamed of, but it was perfect in its own way. Perfect because it was ours. Later, as I looked back on the day, I couldn't help but think about how far I had come. From the little girl who had tried so hard to earn her mother's approval, to the woman standing here today, choosing love, choosing Ethan over everything else. I had finally learned what it meant to stand up for myself. I had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, about fighting for each other, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as we left the reception, hand in hand, I couldn't help but smile. This was our story, and no one, not even my mother, could take that away from us. The moment I stood at the altar, staring into Ethan's eyes, everything else seemed to blur. The rows of guests, the soft hum of voices, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears, it all faded into the background. All that mattered in that instant was him. His face, his warmth, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. There was nothing else. Nothing else could touch me now. I had walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress, the one that wasn't mine, the one that had replaced the wedding gown my mother had ruined. The dress that should have been the centerpiece of my dream day, the one I'd imagined for months. But it didn't matter. Nothing could take away the way Ethan made me feel, not even my mother's betrayal. I was standing here today, about to marry the man I loved, and that was the victory. I reached out to take Ethan's hands, feeling their warmth, their steadiness. His touch was a lifeline, grounding me in the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I could see the pride in his eyes, the unwavering support that had never faltered, not even in the face of all the chaos my family had caused. I knew it hadn't been easy for him. He had witnessed the destruction, the cruelty of my mother, and he had stood by me through it all. That was the man I was about to marry. And in that moment, everything that had happened leading up to this day seemed small compared to the love we shared. As we stood there, the officiant began to speak, his words flowing over me in a gentle wave, grounding me in the reality of what was happening. I had to pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and allow myself to absorb the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about commitment. This was about me and Ethan choosing each other, despite everything that had tried to tear us apart. I could still hear the echoes of my mother's words in my mind, the cruel things she had said about Ethan, about me, but they no longer held any power over me. She wasn't here. She wasn't in control anymore. I was, and I was choosing Ethan. I was choosing the man who had never made me feel anything but loved, cherished, and accepted for who I truly was. I wasn't going to let my mother's poison seep into this moment. This was ours, and nothing could ruin that. Ethan's voice broke through my thoughts, steady and warm as he recited his vows. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I could feel the sincerity in them, and for the first time that day, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. This was real. This wasn't just some fairy tale that had been shattered by the forces around us. This was our story, one that was being written right here, right now, despite everything. "I promise to stand by you," he said, his eyes never leaving mine, no matter what comes our way. "I will be your partner, your rock, your biggest supporter. Together, we'll face whatever life throws at us, and we'll face it with love." The words hung in the air like a promise, like a shield against the world. And in that moment, I realized something. We had already faced so much. We had faced the worst of my mother's interference, the destruction of my wedding dress, the chaos that had threatened to rip everything apart. But we were still here. We were still standing. Together. That was what mattered. We had already proven our love, already fought for it. And now, standing here, in front of all of our friends and family, we were sealing our commitment to one another. As I spoke my vows, my voice was steady, though my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. "I promise to love you," I said, "to support you, to cherish you. I will stand by your side, through everything, just as you've stood by mine. No matter what happens, I will always choose you. Always." I could see the emotion flicker in Ethan's eyes as he took in my words. It was like a weight had been lifted from both of us. This was the moment we had both been waiting for. The moment we could finally put all the pain and uncertainty behind us and move forward. We had already built something beautiful, something strong. Now we were making it official. As the officiant asked if we took each other as husband and wife, I felt a surge of joy so intense it almost knocked the breath out of me. "I do," I said, and I could feel the smile spread across my face. It was a simple word, but it carried so much meaning. It was the culmination of everything we had gone through, everything we had worked for, all the pain and heartache that had brought us to this point. When Ethan said "I do," it was like the world fell away. All the bad things, the doubts, the uncertainty gone. It was just him and me, standing here, about to start our lives together. The kiss that followed was sweet, soft, and full of promise. It was everything I had ever dreamed of and more. As we walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, I could hear the applause around us, the cheers of our guests, but it felt like I was in a bubble. Nothing else mattered. Nothing but Ethan and the life we were going to build. It wasn't the wedding I had planned. It wasn't perfect. But in its imperfection, it had become something better. It had become ours. And that was all I had ever wanted. To marry the man I loved, to start a new chapter of our lives, and to do it on our terms. As we reached the end of the aisle, I looked at Ethan, my heart bursting with love for him. "I can't believe we made it," I whispered, the words a breathless laugh escaping my lips. Ethan squeezed my hand and smiled. "We made it through everything, Anna. And we'll keep making it through, together." And in that moment, I knew he was right. We had faced the storm. And now, we were stepping into the sunshine. Together. The weight of the moment hit me harder than I expected. I had been dreaming about this day for months, picturing how it would go, the flowers, the dress, the music, the guests all there to celebrate our love. But this wasn't how it was supposed to be. My mother's actions had shattered all my plans. And yet, here I was, standing at the altar, about to marry Ethan, the man I loved. The ceremony was beautiful, despite everything. The aisle was lined with white chairs. The flowers were delicate and fresh, and the soft music played in the background as I walked down it. But what caught my attention more than anything was Ethan's face. His expression was a mixture of awe, love, and something else, pride. It was like, in that moment, he was more proud of me than anything else. Proud that I was still standing here, still going through with this wedding despite everything that had happened. Proud that we were about to promise ourselves to each other, despite the chaos, despite the heartbreak that had been thrown at us. As I reached him, I could feel the calmness settle over me like a blanket. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. We were here, together, and that was all that mattered. The weight of my mother's cruel words, her attempts to tear us apart, faded away as I stood next to him. Nothing else was important. I wasn't the perfect bride I had once dreamed of being, but standing there with Ethan, I realized something I hadn't understood before. We were building something even more meaningful than perfection. We were building a life together, one that was ours, with all its flaws, all its bumps, all its imperfections. The officiant's voice broke through my thoughts, asking us to exchange our vows. It felt surreal, as if this was all happening in slow motion. My heart was still racing, but I was no longer scared. In that moment, I knew with everything in me that I had made the right choice. Ethan was my person. No matter what had happened, no matter what was going to happen next, I would always choose him. I had chosen him then, when I first fell in love with him, and I would choose him every day for the rest of my life. And right then, as I stood facing him, I realized that choosing him, standing beside him, was the only thing that mattered. His voice was steady and sure as he recited his vows, and I could feel the sincerity in every word. I promise to love you, to support you, to stand by you no matter what happens. I will be your partner in everything, in every joy, every challenge. I choose you today, tomorrow, and for the rest of my life. The words hit me like a wave, sweeping away the remnants of doubt I had clung to, pushing aside every fear that I hadn't even realized was still there. I was here. I was marrying Ethan. Nothing else mattered. The rest of the world could fade away, but this moment, this promise was ours. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down, determined not to let the emotions overwhelm me. I promise to stand by you, to love you with all that I have, even when the world feels heavy. I will support you, laugh with you, cry with you. No matter what happens, I will always choose you. You are my heart, and I will never stop choosing you. The look in Ethan's eyes when I finished saying those words was more than I could describe. There was a depth to his gaze, something that told me without a doubt that he was just as committed to this as I was. We had both come through so much, and now we were standing here, making this promise to each other. By the power vested in me, the officiant continued, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The words rang out in the air, and for a moment, everything felt like it had slowed down. This was it. We were married. Ethan turned to me, and without hesitation, he kissed me. It wasn't some grand, over-the-top kiss like I'd seen in the movies. It was simple. It was soft. But it was everything. It was our kiss, our beginning, our shared moment. It wasn't about the dress. It wasn't about the wedding or the chaos that had surrounded us. It was about us, our love, our commitment, our future. When we pulled apart, I could see the joy in his eyes, the pride, the relief, and I felt it too. The relief, the weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks, months, even finally lifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The cheers from the guests echoed in the background, and I realized that, for the first time that day, the nerves that had been gnawing at me were gone. I was finally able to take a deep breath, knowing that nothing could take away the love we had just committed to. As we walked down the aisle together, I felt Ethan's hand in mine, steady and strong, and I knew that I was right where I was supposed to be. Everything that had happened before the chaos, the heartbreak, the fear was behind us. This was our beginning, and it was beautiful. I glanced up at Ethan, catching his eye. He smiled at me, his thumb brushing gently over my hand. We made it, he whispered, and I laughed, the sound full of relief. We really did. The ceremony wasn't what I had envisioned. It wasn't the fairy tale I had dreamed of. But in its imperfection, it had become something real, something stronger. And as I walked down the aisle with Ethan by my side, I knew that this wasn't just the end of a wedding. It was the beginning of our life together, and that was enough. In fact, it was more than I ever could have hoped for. The reception felt surreal, a blur of faces and flashing lights, the hum of chatter and laughter all around me. I had imagined this moment so many times before, but nothing could have prepared me for how it actually felt. The overwhelming relief that I wasn't alone anymore, that I wasn't carrying the weight of my mother's expectations and judgments on my shoulders, was almost intoxicating. It was like I could finally breathe for the first time in years. But what was more incredible was the love that had surrounded us, Ethan and me. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my family's approval, trying to make them proud. But here, in this room, surrounded by people who truly cared about us, I realized that I didn't need anyone's validation but my own. I glanced over at Ethan, and he caught my eye with that smile of his, the one that had always melted my heart. His face was the picture of pride and love, and as we stood there together, the world felt perfect in a way I couldn't have imagined. There was no anger, no judgment. There was just us, moving forward into this new chapter of our lives. The night went on, with the usual reception festivities, dancing, laughing, toasts, and for the first time, I let myself truly enjoy it. I was no longer a bride walking on eggshells, worried about what my mother would think or say. I was a woman who had chosen her path, her future, and I was going to embrace it, flaws and all. And it wasn't just me, it was Ethan and me, together, creating something real, something that no one, not even my mother, could take from us. When the speeches began, I could see Ethan's father standing up with his glass raised, looking over at us with a smile that was both proud and slightly somber. I knew how much the day had meant to him too. He had witnessed the breakdown of the family, seen the strain my mother's actions had put on Ethan, and yet, here we were, standing strong, together. I felt a warmth spread through me as he raised his glass, his voice steady as he spoke. To Ethan and Anna, he said, his voice carrying through the room, "You've both shown a strength I could never have imagined. Life is never perfect, but the love you share is. May your journey together be filled with the kind of love that conquers all challenges, because you've already proven you can face anything together." The applause that followed was loud, genuine, and I saw the way Ethan squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with appreciation. He had always been the steady one in the family, the one who kept things together, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. But tonight, I realized that I had been his steady ground too. We had supported each other, fought for each other, and we had come out stronger because of it. After the speeches, Ethan and I shared our first dance as husband and wife. The music played softly, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me close. His body felt like home to me, safe and steady. It was everything I had ever wanted, but had never truly allowed myself to believe I deserved. And now, here we were, in the middle of this beautiful, imperfect night. And I knew that this moment was the beginning of something extraordinary. I looked around the room, at the guests who had stayed, at the friends who had supported us, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. This wasn't a wedding full of societal expectations or the polished perfection I had once thought it should be. This was our wedding, our real, raw, honest wedding, and it had been more beautiful than I could have imagined. Later in the evening, as the dancing continued and the energy of the reception began to settle into something more relaxed, I found myself standing with Ethan by the bar. He looked at me with a smile, and I could see the reflection of the happiness in his eyes. "I don't think I've ever seen you so happy," he said, his voice full of affection. "I've always known you were strong, but tonight, you're glowing." I laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "It's because I feel free, Ethan. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm truly living for myself. For us, not for anyone else." He took a step closer, his hand resting gently on my waist, pulling me in. "That's the way it should be. We're not here for anyone else. We're here for each other." I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. He was right. We were here for each other. This was our moment, our life, and we had built it on a foundation of love and respect. Nothing else mattered anymore. As the night wore on and the reception drew to a close, I realized how much I had grown in just a few short hours. This day, which had started in chaos and heartbreak, had turned into something beautiful, something that was ours. We had overcome so much, and yet here we were, stronger than ever. I had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fitting into some mold or meeting someone else's expectations. It was about embracing each other, flaws and all, and facing the world together. When the final song played and the last guest had left, I found myself standing outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Ethan was by my side, his hand holding mine tightly. I looked up at him, my heart full of everything I had always wanted. He smiled at me, his eyes soft, and I felt like I was finally home. "We made it," I whispered, the words carrying more meaning than I could have imagined. "We did," he said, pulling me into his arms, "and we're going to keep making it, together." And in that moment, I knew that nothing could break what we had. We had fought for each other, for our love, and now we were building a future together, stronger than anything that had come before us. We had made it through the storm, and now we were ready for everything that life had to offer. Our story was just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take us. I know you've been on the edge of your seat, waiting for the twist. Can you believe everything that happened after that moment? It wasn't just about the dress, it was about love, family, and standing up for yourself. But what's next for me and my new husband? You won't believe the shocking ending. If you're curious about how this story truly ends, hit that like button and leave your thoughts below. What would you have done in my shoes? I've learned that life isn't about perfection. It's about staying true to yourself and choosing the people who truly support you, no matter what. My journey hasn't been easy, but it taught me to stand up for what I believe in, to fight for my happiness, and to never let anyone's judgment or expectations define me. We all face challenges, but the key is resilience, love, and the strength to move forward. Don't let anyone, not even family, dictate your worth. You are enough, just as you are. Stay true to yourself, and the rest will follow.